They say that in the early winters of the 20th century, certain stories only survived because the wind in the Ozark Mountains refused to forget them. Before continuing, the narrator leaves the viewer with a barely whispered request. Write in the comments where you are watching this and what time it is there right now. After that, the narrative plunges back into the silence of that era. Between 1880 and 1905, the Frostmoor region, a village scattered among damp hills, narrow pastures and weathered wooden bridges, was one of those places where life seemed to pass without haste, but always with some hidden weight. Missouri newspapers rarely mentioned the place, except when winter punished it with snowstorms that isolated entire families for weeks. And it was in this environment, as beautiful as it was harsh, that Ellen Rokesby lived, later known in the archives as the Widow of Frostmoor. Ellen was a woman of discreet presence, almost always seen wearing a thick grey wool coat and a black veil that protected her face from the icy wind. There was no ostentation, no haste, just a kind of quiet steadfastness. She was in her early 40s when the case of the missing travelers would cross her existence like a red-hot iron wire. But her past, reconstructed from letters, household inventories and neighbors' accounts, already bore scars even before that winter of 1905. Documents from Taney County show that Ellen had married young to Samuel Rokesby, a farmer descended from Scottish immigrants. The Rokesby farm was located on the eastern border of Frostmoor, on a strip of rugged land that ended in a narrow valley known locally as Hollow Creek. Old maps show irregular roads that connected to stagecoach routes, small shops and rest stops for travelers crossing the region on their way to Arkansas. These paths commonly served as passageways for merchants, wanderers, migrant families, and groups of seasonal workers. It was there that Ellen built her life, and also where she lost it. In 1897, Samuel died after a wagon overturned during a storm. His body was found 6 days later when the water level dropped. The village was moved. Ellen withdrew, and from that year on, witnesses say the widow almost never crossed the center of the village. It was said that she preferred to stay between the main house, the barn, and the old root cellar near the creek. She led a methodical, solitary life, sustained by exchanges of supplies with distant neighbors and the small horse farm left by her husband. Up to that point, nothing stood out from the typical difficulties of the time. What catches the researcher's eye, and what begins the real mystery of this file, is what appears in Sheriff Alan Brackett's notes in October 1904. A couple of short sentences, almost without context. The widow Rokesby received travelers last night. She said they were heading south, Hollow Creek Road. One of them asked about the back shed. She did not answer. On its own, the record would not indicate anything extraordinary. But the disturbing detail emerges when we cross-reference this note with the March 1905 report, when 56 travelers, men, women, and 2 entire families, disappeared along the night route that passed exactly by the bend where Frostmoor's widow's property was located. The most intriguing point, however, lies in the description of an object that appears repeatedly in subsequent testimonies. A small leather-bound notebook, supposedly used by Ellen after her husband's death. A notebook that no one else could find. A notebook whose contents, according to some residents, were not to be read by anyone else. As the historical investigation progresses through the fragmented traces left in the dust of the time, it becomes impossible to ignore a fact present in all official records. The last person seen in the area before the disappearance of the 56 travelers was Ellen Rokesby, standing on the porch of her own house, staring intently at the road, as if waiting for something that should never have arrived. And, even more disturbingly, there is a lost note on the back of a 1905 tax document, written in the shaky hand of the night watchman at the nearby station. It reads, "Lights in the widow's barn. Many. They have not been lit since. What happened that night remains shrouded in silence, misunderstandings and memories erased by time." But this archive takes its first step here, facing this initial gap between what is known and what has never been said. And it is precisely at this point, in the dim glow of lights that should not be there, that the mystery of Frostmoor begins to take shape. When Frostmoor's records are examined patiently, it becomes clear that daily life in the region before the traveler's disappearance was made up of harsh, silent routines deeply marked by the constant relationship with the climate. The long winters and perennial humidity shaped everything: the mood of families, the rhythms of late harvests, the sparse encounters between neighbors who lived miles apart on winding trails. The farm of the widow Rokesby, on the other hand, seemed to exist apart, a motionless point on the border between the road and the forest, as if it had been left there by time and never returned to the normal flow of the community. Documents from 1900 to 1904 reveal a consistent pattern of behavior. Ellen woke up before sunrise, lit the wood stove, and fed the horses. Her land, consisting of low hills and a narrow valley facing Hollow Creek, required considerable physical labor. She did it almost always alone. Weekly exchanges were made with two distant neighbors, the Durland family to the north and the Hawthorne couple to the south. There were never any reports of disagreements. There were never any rumors of eccentricity. Just the image of a woman marked by loss, sustaining her own life with discipline and silence. Still, something in the small cracks of the testimonies suggests that the widow had habits that few dared to comment on directly. The Durlands stated in a 1906 testimony that she sometimes walked along the road after sunset, even in the bitter cold, as if waiting for someone or something. Mrs. Hawthorne mentioned that on some mornings she would see smoke coming from the back shed, a space rarely used since Samuel's death, which, according to her, always seemed to be locked from the inside. These observations, scattered throughout aged paperwork, do not sound like accusations, just impressions of the time. Small fragments that, read individually, cause no concern, but when put together, begin to form a more complex picture. Ellen's routine seemed perfectly ordinary on the surface, but there was a rhythm to it that did not match the rest of Frostmoor. Travelers, on the other hand, followed a predictable flow. Stagecoach records, lodging receipts and tickets found decades later show that traffic on the Hollow Creek route increased significantly in the early months of 1905. Migrant workers crossed the region in groups. Families traveled in modest wagons, and merchants made the journey between Missouri and Arkansas repeatedly. The colder nights forced many to camp near farms, asking for water or temporary shelter. The property of the widow Rokesby, precisely because it was at the junction of two trails, became an inevitable stopping point. There are unofficial reports, passed down orally among residents, that Ellen offered hot water and shelter for horses on stormy nights, a gesture for which she was never formally recognized. According to the Durland's son, who was only 12 at the time, travelers left grateful but always quiet, as if they had seen something they didn't want to talk about. He himself admitted, in a statement made in his old age, that this could have been just a boy's imagination. But it is curious how this tone of silence, this air of something left unsaid, is repeated in records of different kinds. Another point that caught the researchers' attention is the community's growing concern about sounds coming from the direction of the Rokesby farm. Several residents in different years mention soft hammering, movement of wood, and a continuous, muffled sound, as if someone were dragging something heavy during the early hours of the morning. These reports were never brought to the attention of the authorities, as there was no indication of any crime. In rural areas, unexpected noises were part of life. Even so, the convergence of these observations, coming from such varied sources, raises the hypothesis that Ellen was engaged in unusual nocturnal activity. But perhaps the most significant element of this period prior to her disappearance is the emotional state of the widow herself. There are no direct records written by her. The alleged leather notebook remains missing. However, later testimonies describe a woman who alternated between moments of delicate cordiality and a kind of intense distraction, as if she were always solving something in her mind. One of the few times Ellen spoke openly about Samuel, according to Mrs. Hawthorne, she reportedly said, "There are things in life that only make sense when you learn to listen to the silence." The phrase, though poetic, became a recurring enigma in subsequent investigations. Missing travelers began crossing Frostmoor more frequently in late February 1905. Groups of merchants carried fabrics, groceries, tools. Entire families, coming from the east, sought cheaper land in Arkansas. Records from Northwood Station show that in the week before the event, at least 3 freight cars and 2 family wagons passed through the Hollow Creek area. All of them, inevitably, crossed the curve of the Rokesby farm. And it is precisely here that the archives reveal a detail that is impossible to ignore. In the 3 days leading up to the disappearance, no one, absolutely no one, saw smoke coming out of the widow's chimney. For a woman who depended on a wood stove to heat her home, cook, and survive the cold, this is more than a curiosity. It is a serious deviation from her routine. It is not known whether she was absent, ill, or simply secluded in the back shed, as indicated by a loose note found in the Hawthorne correspondence. Ellen is acting strangely. The front door remains closed, but we swear we saw light inside the shed. This contrast between absolute silence in the house and activity in the shed marks the first concrete thread of tension in the records. Something was being prepared there, something that travelers, by coincidence or fate, would encounter as they passed along that stretch of road that night. And when one of the last group saw Ellen standing on the porch, staring intently at the road, their testimony ends abruptly. They did not reach the next village. They left no traces beyond this silent description. What began as a succession of everyday oddities would soon turn into a night that history could no longer piece back together. And it is in the interval between these last records and the total disappearance of the 56 travelers that the mood of the case begins to change, as if the region itself were breathing differently on the eve of what was to come. Because something, still invisible to the archives, was already moving in the darkness of Frostmoor. When attempting to reconstruct the night that 56 travelers disappeared on the Frostmoor route, one must accept that what exists is not a continuous line, but a torn fabric, pieces of testimonies, approximate times, loose notes, and silences that by themselves say as much as words. Still, by cross-referencing everything that remains, sheriff's reports, station records, later letters, it is possible to trace a plausible sequence of events. And it is in this sequence that the figure of the widow Ellen Rokesby gradually ceases to be just a distant point in the landscape and becomes the center of a circle of doubts. On the afternoon of that day, the cold arrived early. Witnesses speak of an overcast sky, heavy clouds descending over the hills, a wind that carried the smell of damp wood and soggy earth even before nightfall. The Ozark Mountains region, accustomed to sudden changes in weather, seemed to retreat into a kind of silent anticipation. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, according to the Northwood Station record, a group of travelers, merchants and 2 families with small children, set off southward, taking with them wagons, supplies, and some pack animals. 2 men on horseback joined them shortly thereafter. In all, adding previous and subsequent groups, the number of people who would pass through Hollow Creek that night would reach 56. The estimated time for them to cross the curve at the Rokesby farm was between 7 and 8 o'clock in the evening. The sun would already be completely hidden, and the poorly marked road would depend on the dim light of oil lanterns. There were no lampposts, there were no clear markings on the edges. Only the memory of the route, the trail of old wheels, and the dark line of trees cutting across the horizon. The few direct accounts of that night begin with a statement given years later by a wagon driver named Elias Hargrove, the last person to see the group before they entered the Frostmoor stretch. He was coming from the opposite direction, returning to Northwood, and told the sheriff in 1907, "I passed them just before Widow Rokesby's bend. They were tired, yes, but calm. I remember seeing a woman in a dark shawl, settling a child on her lap. There was muffled laughter. Someone commented on finding shelter further on. The sky was very low, and the road was damp. When I looked back, I saw the row of lanterns receding, like a string of yellow dots in the dark. After that, all I heard was the wind." This string of yellow dots is one of the strongest images we have of that night. 56 people crammed into a few meters of road, creaking carts, horses pounding their hooves in the mud, tired voices, and a growing darkness enveloping everything. There is no mention at this point of any conflict, argument, or immediate danger. The archives emphasize an exhausted normality, the routine of people who have been traveling for days and just want to get to a dry place to sleep. What happens after that point is reconstructed from two main sources: the night watchman at the nearby station and Sheriff Ellen Brackett himself, who patrolled the area around the route on nights when the weather was unstable. The guard, a man named Patrick Doyle, noted that at around 7:40 p.m., he saw an unusual glow in the direction of Hollow Creek in the distance. It was not a single point of light, like an isolated lantern, but something more intense and diffuse, as if more than one flame were burning at the same time. In his note, he writes, "I thought it was a group camping early on the road. It seemed strong but muffled, like a fire in a covered area." The sheriff, in an official report, mentions that while making a round of the northern stretch shortly before 8:30, he noticed something curious at the Rokesby farm. The main house was dark, with no sign of light in the windows. However, the barn, and in particular the wooden extension built at the back, known among neighbors as a tack and supply shed, seemed to breathe an internal flickering light that escaped in thin streams through the cracks in the boards. Brackett describes the scene objectively. There was no fire in sight in the kitchen or living room, but the back shed had intermittent flashes of light, like lamps or lanterns moving around inside. I could hear, albeit very faintly, the creaking of wood and heavy dragging noises mixed with the wind. Cross-referencing these two accounts, the picture that emerges is of a night in which the travelers were slowly advancing toward a stretch of road flanked by seemingly dark terrain, but with a structure, the rear shed of the Rokesby farm, that was strangely active. This is where the timelines converge. The time when the group should have been passing the curve coincides with the interval when the irregular lights are seen inside the shed. No survivors were recorded. There is no subsequent letter, no note found by the roadside, no testimony from anyone who was among the 56 and escaped. What remains, then, are only physical traces observed the following day, and that is precisely where the historical narrative intensifies. On the morning after the travelers' supposed passage, the sheriff returns to the area. The cold was drier, the wind was still biting, and a thin layer of frost covered the fences and the roof of the widow's house. Brackett reports that he called Ellen twice from the gate, with no response. The house remained with the front door closed. There was no smoke coming from the chimney. The silence of the property contrasted with very clear marks on the road. There were deep ruts from wagon wheels, footprints of men, women and children marking the hardened mud, as well as signs of horse hooves that, at one point, seemed to converge slightly toward the side fence of the farm. It is not possible to know for sure if the entire group approached the property, but something indicates a pause, a slight detour, perhaps to ask for water, shelter, or guidance. He describes that some footprints strayed from the main trail and approached the wooden gate that led to the side yard. These marks, however, disappeared a few meters further on, as if they had been partially erased by frost or trampled by other subsequent footsteps. Next to the fence, near the entrance to the pasture, two small darkened circular marks were found on the ground, which years later would be interpreted as possible remains of soot or burnt lamp oil. No bodies. No abandoned wagon, no loose animals. The road, from there, continued on, but without the logical continuity of those tracks. It was as if suddenly that whole mass of people, wood, and metal had been torn from the surface of the route, leaving only fragmented traces before the curve and nothing but indistinct tracks after it. As for the widow, the report indicates that she was only found hours later, in the late morning, when the Hawthorns, concerned about the unusual silence, went to the farm on their own. Later reports say they found her sitting at the kitchen table with an untouched glass of water in front of her and the same old wool coat still on. She answered questions with short, almost mechanical sentences. She said she had had a difficult night, that the wind seemed to invade the roof, and that she had hardly slept. When asked if she had seen a large group passing by on the road, she simply said, "I heard distant voices, but I didn't go out to look." That detail, "I didn't go out to look," is repeated ad nauseum in subsequent interrogations. For someone whose routine included checking the road on so many cold nights, the explanation sounded strange. Even stranger when it is noted that, on that same day, the sheriff returned to the property and, walking discreetly around the barn, noticed the lock on the small harness compartment in the rear shed, showing signs of recent use. Metal scratches, worn wood around it, as if the door had been opened and closed several times in a short period of time. There was no noise coming from inside, no peculiar smell, nothing that would justify, at the time, more invasive action by the authorities. The case of the travelers, at that first moment, was still treated as a possible detour, an unforeseen delay, a group that might have taken another route. It took days for the notion of definitive disappearance to take hold, but for the researcher observing the whole picture decades later, it is almost impossible to ignore the geometry of the facts. A large group approaching the curve, unusual lights in the widow's shed at the same time, signs of approach on the fence, and signs of lanterns near the gate. A woman who, for the first time in many years, says she did not go to see the road, and a small wooden compartment at the back of the barn, whose lock shows signs of heavy use on that very night. The inventory of the property, made months later, describes this compartment with a simple and direct expression: harness and storage room with reinforced locks. In the documents, it is referred to only as the room. Among the residents, however, a name began to circulate in whispered conversations, a name that never officially entered the records, but which crossed time until it reached the ears of those who reopened the case years later. A name that connects the widow, the barn, and the night when 56 people disappeared without a trace on the Frostmoor road. They began to call it the connecting chamber, the compartment where everything seemed to converge. And it was in front of the locked door of this chamber that the last concrete clue emerged before the mystery was sealed forever. When word spread that the group of travelers had not arrived at the next village, the Frostmoor community reacted first with cautious concern, then with a kind of unease that had rarely crossed that quiet region. At first they attributed the delay to bad weather, the possibility that they had sought makeshift shelter at some distant farm or even taken an alternate route to avoid flooded areas. But as the days passed without any sign of the 56 travelers, the idea of a simple change of course became untenable. Sheriff Ellen Brackett was the first to organize a formal search. Men from neighboring families, some volunteers from Northwood, and 2 workers who were passing through offered to comb the route. Riding slowly, they examined every uneven spot, every muddy patch, every area where fallen trees might have blocked the road. They found no damaged wagons, no loose animals, no clothing, no bags, no personal items, nothing to suggest that the group had been in an accident. The complete absence of traces disturbed even the most rational. At one point, when there was talk of extending the search beyond Hollow Creek, the sheriff returned to the Rokesby farm. Reports indicate that he believed he had overlooked some detail on his first visit. Something small, perhaps a mark on the ground, or a forgotten object. What he found was not exactly a clue, but behavior that, in the eyes of an experienced investigator, seemed out of place. The widow seemed nervous. She was not trembling, nor was she aggressive, just overly attentive. As if every word that came out of the sheriff's mouth was weighed, measured, analyzed against something she herself carried inside. Brackett describes that, when asked again about the previous night, Ellen looked away, not out of obvious guilt, but as if trying to reorganize memories she did not want to revisit. She simply said, "I heard footsteps on the road, maybe more than one group. The wind distorts everything. I couldn't say." That answer, as innocent as it seemed, did not correspond to what the residents had witnessed over the years. Ellen had always been able to distinguish sounds from afar. She could tell the difference between wagons and horsemen and travelers on foot, travelers and loose animals. For a woman who had spent half her life watching the road, the sudden inability to recognize such a large group sounded unlikely. It was then that, for the first time, the sheriff directly mentioned the light seen in the back shed. She took a deep breath, held her hand on the doorframe, and said simply, "I was organizing things. Samuel left a lot of stuff piled up in there." The sheriff took note, but described the response as evasive and overly quick. The following days saw the search intensify. They combed creeks, back trails, ravines, and even an old abandoned mine. The Durland and Hawthorne families helped by providing supplies and meals to the men who insisted on continuing the search. Gradually, however, the once determined faces began to bow to an undeniable fact. The entire group seemed to have been swallowed up by the wind. No strong rumors emerged that first week, but soft whispers began to circulate. Mrs. Durland mentioned to her neighbor that she had seen Ellen walking near the barn in the early hours of the morning, a few days before the disappearance. The young man from the Hawthorne family mentioned hearing a long, drawn-out, metallic noise coming from the direction of the farm. These were disconnected reports, with no legal weight, but they fueled hushed conversations on porches and in barns. The turning point, which gives this historical file an emotional and human dimension, does not come from a police discovery, but from a statement left years later by one of the search volunteers, Thomas Eberly. In 1912, he wrote a letter to his nephew describing the lasting impression of that investigation. According to him, during the search of the Rokesby farm on one of the coldest days of March, he approached the back shed alone, while the sheriff talked to Ellen in the house. And as he examined the door of the storage room, the so-called connecting room, he noticed something he never forgot. "I touched the wood," he wrote, "and felt residual heat. Not heat from a fire, but from a recent human presence, as if someone had been inside for a long time. I looked through the cracks, but saw nothing, only darkness, compact darkness, as if the space was smaller than it actually was. I didn't say anything to the sheriff. I don't know why. Maybe because she was so alone, so broken inside." The testimony, although belated, gives the investigation a layer that official reports never fully acknowledged. The emotional perception of someone who lived with the farm environment, with the widow's silence, and with the feeling that something had accumulated there. Not necessarily objects, but a kind of human tension, unresolved memory, an internal struggle between keeping and revealing. The most important revelation, however, is not in this mysterious warmth, but in what emerged when the community tried to understand the widow not as a suspect, but as a person. In the weeks following the disappearance, Ellen became increasingly reclusive. She did not seek to maintain an appearance of innocence, nor did she react with irritation to questions. She just seemed to carry a deep weariness, as if Frostmoor Road itself, with its noises and absences, had settled on her shoulders. The most moving account of this period comes from Mrs. Hawthorne, who visited Ellen on a gray afternoon. In a 1906 statement, she reported finding the widow sitting near the window, holding something small in her hand. Perhaps a piece of leather, perhaps a strip of fabric. When her neighbor tried to talk about the search, Ellen merely murmured, "Some things are lost before they disappear," and she turned her gaze back to the bend in the road. This phrase would become central to the historical interpretation of the case, not because it revealed guilt, but because it exposed the way Ellen saw the world, as if everything, including people, could undergo a silent process of internal disappearance before actually disappearing. The big revelation in this section is not a police conclusion, but a human pattern. The widow somehow seemed to know more about that night than she admitted, not in the sense of participating in something criminal, but in recognizing, perhaps in a brutally intimate way, that kind of sudden loss, of absolute disappearance, of irretrievable emptiness. She herself had experienced this with Samuel, and many historians suggest that, upon seeing the group of travelers approaching the bend, Ellen felt not fear, but recognition, as if she were witnessing once again the beginning of an absence called destiny. The whole story of the widow Rokesby then seems to take on symbolic contours. Not because she did anything to those people, but because when confronted by the sheriff, she chose to remain silent, a silence that compromised no one, and at the same time, helped no one. And so, when the community finally accepted that the search had come to an end without answers, all that remained was the echo of that wooden door, the chamber door, that no one had the courage to open in that month of March 1905. An echo that, even today, continues to reverberate in the archives as the only possible boundary between what was seen and what will never be said. There are archives that stand the test of time, not because they provide answers, but because they preserve questions that no one has been able to fully formulate. The case of the 56 travelers who disappeared on the Frostmoor route belongs to that category of stories that do not quite fit the mold of investigation, but also do not dissolve into folklore. It remains in an intermediate territory, a space made up of gaps, hesitations, absences, and fragments of memory that survive only because someone, at some point, decided to record them. Decades have passed since that night in 1905. Many of the families involved moved away from the region even before World War I. Sheriff Brackett died in 1919 without ever publicly admitting that he believed in the possibility of some kind of serious deviation from the route. The Durlands, now elderly, insisted that the widow was just a tired woman who had seen more loss than the human heart should bear. The Hawthorns continued to refer to the noises in the barn as something that must have a common explanation, but never offered a solid hypothesis. The Rokesby property itself changed hands countless times over the century. Part of the land was absorbed by the forest, part was turned into sporadic pasture, and part was sold to settlers who never knew the original story. The house collapsed in the 1930s. The barn held out a little longer, but lost its roof and eventually collapsed under the weight of a particularly harsh winter. The rear chamber, the so-called connecting chamber, disappeared before historians could even examine it carefully. What existed there was swallowed up by rain, time, and silence, like so many other fragments of rural life in the Ozark Mountains. Still, the name of Frostmoor's widow continued to appear sporadically in state archives, almost always indirectly, on old receipts, in the margins of letters, in farm inventories bearing her shaky signature. Ellen Rokesby died in 1914 in her early 50s, in simple and unceremonious circumstances. Her death certificate mentions exhaustion and organic frailty, a definition too broad for someone whose entire life had been marked by silent resistance. She left no children, no direct heirs. She left only the land, a few objects, and what remained of her presence in the community's memories. But there is something in the late testimonies, especially those that emerged in the 1940s, that shapes the way the case came to be remembered. It is not an accusation, nor is it a defense. It is a kind of belated compassion, arising when those who were young in 1905 were old enough to view their own lives with more gentleness. Many of these indirect survivors, neighbors, volunteers, distant residents, began to cast the widow in a different role, not as a suspect, but as an unwitting witness to a tragedy whose extent none of them could measure. It is at this point that this archive, reconstructed from scattered documents, finds its human dimension. Because over the decades, the emotional center of the mystery shifted from the disappearance itself to the figure of a woman whose life had been made up of successive losses. Ellen witnessed her husband's death, saw the surrounding lands change hands, faced winters that shaped the soul like steel, and watched the road, always the road, take people away without ever bringing them back. So when 56 travelers disappeared at once, she may have felt something that no police report can record: the repetition of an emptiness, the confirmation of an implacable logic in the world she lived in. There is no evidence that she participated in, provoked, or witnessed anything directly. What there is an emotional pattern, a gesture, a silence, the way she looked at the road before and how she never looked at it the same way again. The researcher writing these lines recognizes that it is not possible to determine precisely what happened that night. The hypotheses are many and all incomplete. a collective detour that led to an accident never documented, a structural collapse of some unknown bridge, an encounter with a group that would have led them to another route, or some kind of natural incident that erased traces without leaving visible remains. Each of these possibilities has been studied, and none of them is entirely convincing. What remains, therefore, is not a conclusion, but an echo that spans generations, that is reborn whenever someone opens one of the old reports, that resurfaces when a historian, out of habit, notes the name of the widow and realizes that something about that discreet figure raises more questions than answers. In the end, we do not know if Ellen kept any secrets, if she feared anything, if she sensed the tragedy, or if she just carried the pain of not being able to help when she realized that fate was moving too fast for any human intervention. We only know that she was there, present at the bend in the road, in the light of the shed, in the silence of the following morning. And that is precisely what, so many years later, gives the story its deepest gravity. Not the certainty of an extraordinary event, but the awareness that some lives become involuntary witnesses to mysteries that time never returns. No authority recorded the last words of Frostmoor's widow. None of her letters survived. No diary was found. Her silence remains intact, like a frame protecting the void. And so, as we close this file, only this reflection remains. Sometimes what disappears is not only those who leave, but also those who stay. And that is how Frostmoor learned that silence may be the only answer that history can offer.